Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. My name is Matthew Raskoff. I'm Vice Provost for Digital Education at Stanford University. This is the second event in our new series of book conversations, Academic Innovation for the Public Good, which are ongoing dialogues about how education can innovate in ways that are informed, humane, and rooted. The Stanford Digital Education team has organized this program in partnership with our colleagues at Trinity College, along with Stanford Humanities Center's Recovering the University as a Public Good initiative and the Stanford Pathways Lab. I also thank Kristen Eshelman, Vice President for Library and Information Technology at Trinity College, my collaborator in this series, and I am joined tonight by her Trinity colleague Yolanda Bergstrom Lynch, a research instruction and outreach librarian. Yoli will close us out at the end of the program tonight. As I said, tonight's event is the second in a series of 10 nationally syndicated author conversations, which are conducted over Zoom. Each event features a prominent author of a new book in the field, as well as an expert colleague in conversation with them about their work. For a full list of participating authors and interviewers, please visit our event calendar, and we'll put a link in the Zoom chat now. We have a terrific lineup of speakers, and registration is free and open to the public. These talks are syndicated nationwide by our institutional co-sponsors who are listed on this slide. We also have one late-breaking edition of Notre Dame University, which we're very glad is joining us in this collaboration. If your institution is not represented on this list and you would like to be a co-sponsor, please do let us know. There's no cost to co-sponsorship. You simply post the events on your local events calendars and newsletters, and we'll include your institution on the list. With that, I'm pleased to introduce Ron Daniels, president of Johns Hopkins University, which is a very fitting institution, I think, to include in this series because it was the seat of America's arguably most important academic innovation, which was the modern research university. President Daniels' recent book, What Universities Owe Democracy, written with Grant Shreve and Phil Spector, argues that higher education has a critical role to play at this moment. He'll be interviewed tonight by Carol Quillen, president of Davidson College and one of my professional role models. I'm so grateful to both of you for joining us tonight, Ron and Carol. Please wave and greet everybody. Really, really wonderful to have you as part of this series. Before I turn the floor over to Carol, I just want to briefly outline the format of tonight's program. This conversation is part of an ongoing dialogue, and as such, we'll be leaving the Zoom chat open for comments and questions. We'll monitor the Zoom chat for instances of any inappropriate or disruptive language, and if necessary, we'll remove users from the event. I don't anticipate that happening. Following the conclusion of tonight's author conversation, we'll open the floor to audience questions. If you want to submit a question during the event, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will do our best to acknowledge and include as many of the questions that we get from the audience as possible. Thank you so much for being with us, and take it away, Carol.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and welcome everybody. We're excited to be here, and I'm really excited and such a privilege and a gift to be able to have this conversation with Ron and then to get right to your questions, which I'm sure you have many questions about this important topic and also Ron's fascinating and enlightening book. So I mean, just to get started, Ron, I'm sure people would like to hear a little bit about why this book and why now. And you talk a little bit about this point of vulnerability with respect to democratic backsliding as one of the reasons why you chose to write this book. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you came to write it and why this book now. And then maybe what's the one thing you want your readers to take away from your book when they finish that last page?
So, first, Carol, it's just great to be able to have this opportunity to spend some time with you and to talk about the book, and really quite excited about the opportunity to be part of this forum. And I noticed at the outset that Johns Hopkins name was not identified as a sponsor. And so when you said, all you got to do is say that you'll post it on your website and there's no cost, well, that I think I can start off and say, Johns Hopkins wants to be part of this enterprise. So I hope at the next session will be prominently displayed at the outset of it. So having said that, you asked me why this book, why now? And I think it starts with, for me at least, the sense that we are at a very fragile point in not just American, but indeed in international democracy. And of course, in the international case, we have seen year by year by year, just a steady erosion of the number of countries that could be classified as true, vibrant democracies internationally. And so, this sense that, as some have called it, we're in a democratic recession, of course, provides part of the backdrop. But quite apart from the international trends, we've seen within our own country, just a deepening level of discord, polarization, diminution of facts, deep suspicion of citizens whose political views differ from our own, just the hardening of political discourse, all the things that I think in conjunction really undermine the quality, the vibrancy of democratic life. And if there were any doubt about the severity of the threat to American democracy, then at least to my mind, January 6th provided, I think, a very powerful and compelling proof point of how vulnerable we are, in fact, at this point in time. So for all these reasons, this seems to me a moment in which, as we know, in public discourse, we're worried about the state of democracy and thinking about ways in which we can shore it up. And it's in that context that I felt, and Carol, I'm sure you feel this as well as a university president, but we often think about the core institutions of democracy, and we think about independent courts, how important an independent judiciary is. We think about the role of a vibrant and effective and well-informed media and an unbiased media. We think about competitive politics. So we think about these as the core institutions that determine the quality of our democratic life. But it's interesting that as much as we talk about traditionally those institutions as being implicated as the core institutions of democracy, I don't think we talk enough about universities and colleges as being critical and, as I argue in the book, indispensable institutions for democracy. And so for me, this was in part an opportunity to tell the case as to why I think that that democracy requires strong universities, strong colleges to flourish. And if that's so, if we are as indispensable as some of the other institutions I mentioned a moment ago for the strength of democracy, then the question is, are we doing all that we can to ensure that democracy is flourishing? And are there ways in which, perhaps as much as we think we've done to advance the democratic project, we've just got to do more? And for me, it's that last point that I hope is a key takeaway of the book, which is that if we take seriously the idea that we're at a vulnerable point, perhaps distinctly in the minds of many commentators, distinctly vulnerable point in the character of at least our modern democratic experiment, then it seems to me that we as university leaders and as citizens of the university more generally have to ask the question, what more can we do? And if we believe that this is that moment of peril, then I think it really behooves us to do more to strengthen the quality of the contributions we're making. So for me, it's just that hope that this leads to an agenda for action and engagement on some of the dimensions that I talk about within the book.
Yeah. So I think, you clearly, point to what does feel like a moment of precarity in democratic life. And we have all this evidence that the institutions that perhaps we've taken for granted are more fragile than we recognized, and that it's on us as people who benefit from these institutions to nurture them and care for them. And what's the university's role in that project? And I think you make a really compelling case around that, and communicate a sense of urgency to those of us in higher ed about that obligation. One of the things that I wondered as I was reading your book is, it seems like there are people who also sort of doubt the efficacy of these institutions themselves, maybe, and question whether the institutions that we've inherited are actually up to the task of building a truly democratic society, and sort of some of the tensions that you point to in your book between liberalism and democracy, how those play out in the creation of our institutions. And I wonder, how you would respond to that, sort of, I'm sure you've heard this on your campus from students, or like sort of basic skepticism about these institutions, and how that would figure into the specific role that universities might play in the nurturing and preservation of democratic life. That was a long question.
It's a great question, Carol. And I think, at least for me, it starts with, first and foremost, asking the question, quite apart from how we think about rehabilitating and strengthening our core institutions, have we even really been effective, particularly as educators, in transmitting the case for these institutions to our students? And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the extent to which universities can be important places for educating students in the foundations of democracy. And this doesn't have to be, to my mind, something that is so romantic and uncritical that it's just, commanding allegiance without a compelling case for why people should be sympathetic to and support of these institutions. And I think one can talk about the aspirations of these institutions at the same time noting their failures and the extent to which we're constantly, one would think, in a process of improving those institutions. So I think, for me at least, it's a sense of, the first point is we really do have to communicate and ensure that at least we provided the foundation to our students to understand the unique aspects of liberal democracy and how enormously challenging, but how, at least for those of us who believe that it's these institutions that are better than any others that are out there for promoting core ideas of freedom and equality. And with that foundation, then to imagine you can have the open discussion and be willing to engage the critiques and think about strengthening those institutions. But, when one looks at the fact, and this is one of the statistics that I unearthed during the work on this book, but when you think about, the fact that about 25% of the students graduating from American high schools, at best about 25%, have any sort of basic command of the core foundations of democratic institutions, the nature of American government, the ideas that animated these institutions. And think about, those students then graduating and going into colleges, universities, post-secondary education in the country. There's about 70% of students who graduate from high school will go off into those institutions. And think about them coming to us, but without any sort of awareness of the character of these institutions. And yes, there are some who have a very thoughtful and compelling argument as to describing the failures of them. But for a lot of students, I've really been struck by the fact that they just don't even know the case for why these institutions matter. So again, I think this goes to the point of, before we even get into thoughtful and constructive critique, we've got to be confident that we've actually provided the foundations of understanding. And again, for an idea and for a set of institutions that we know are really hard to activate and are fragile, as you said before in the opening. And so, that's the balance.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that we're all thinking about in education is, one, students maybe are coming to us with much sort of less awareness of the institutions that structure political life in this country, just say in this country. And then also, I would say, a kind of skepticism about the political generally, right? And so for me, part of the joy of reading your book was to just step back and say, okay, we have to make the case for politics, that actually the political is the arena in which humans work out their differences and manage to live together without killing one another. And whatever that arena looks like to you, like we have these democratic institutions, but whatever that political arena looks like to you, you've got to care about it, right? That it's a part of being a person, that you care about the political. And I think even that is not taken for granted anymore, that there should be this realm where we work out a way to live together without killing each other, and maybe even learning how to learn from one another. And you point this out in your book, that universities have this amazing opportunity, residential institutions, to bring together people from all different all walks of life, all different views, all different backgrounds, and actually compel this group of people to live together. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that context for learning about liberal democracy and the role that universities can play in fostering that.
So, as much as I think that there's an important role for the university in providing ways of teaching democracy, and again, to the point that it's not like this is, as one other says, it's not like this is inherited through the gene pool. I mean, it has to be taught, it has to be learned. One really has to be intentional about this. And I just will say parenthetically, particularly as a Canadian coming to the United States 15 years ago, and being exposed to this, this amazing experiment in democracy, and knowing all the strengths and the failures and the blemishes of American history. But what I was so struck by coming here was, the extent to which this formal education, in a sense, we really do have to teach the rudiments of democracy, wasn't being done at the high school level and certainly at the university level. So that that provides some of the story. And then I think another complementary part of this is that quite apart from the actual formal moments in which one can teach the ideas of liberal democracy, the fact that, as you said, you're bringing incredibly and interesting diverse student bodies together. You're having people live cheek by jowl with one another, who we know in this country that is increasingly we're separating ourselves in, and by race, by socioeconomic status, now increasingly by political view. The one thing we know that universities are doing, and particularly in the absence of mandatory national service of some type, is they're bringing people together of increasingly diverse backgrounds. And that seems to me to be, for the 4 years that we've got students in a residential campus, that seems to me to be an incredibly exciting time to start being able to not just simply teach democracy, but to model pluralism and the kinds of debates that you're talking about, and the conversations that we think are so important as a way of fueling our democratic imagination. And the fact that as we know over the last several years, and I start off, this has been true at Hopkins, but the extent to which we see in exit surveys and so forth, that our students at the end of 4 years will often say, they never really had a serious conversation with someone of another race or someone of a different political viewpoint. That the number of students who will describe that is distressing, again, given the opportunities of this 4-year experience. And so, even when we think about in the case of Hopkins, we've changed it recently, but the fact that for a long time now, we've been letting students from the time they come to university select their own roommates instead of doing what's been done in the past where people are randomly assigned. Again, we're fostering the kind of enclave-like nature of the worlds that we live in before going to university. So I think in a long-winded way, the university represents an opportunity to disrupt all of that, to mess it up. And when you've got these diverse populations, then the question is, how do you really sort of animate the conversations, get people to, not just simply learn how to debate with one another, but to truly do the kind of engaged listening to, as I always say, and this is my legal training, is trying to figure out what are the best arguments that your opponent has, and trying to figure out whether there's any part of what they're saying that would cause you to rethink a position of conviction. But again, we're doing precious little of that in American life generally, but I think we can do this on our campuses. And even trying to move away from a lot of the single speaker events that a lot of us do regularly on campuses, and try and have structured conversations across different political viewpoints and perspectives. So again, we can model this idea that you can have hard conversations on difficult topics with people you intensely disagree with, but somehow you can find some moments of fellow citizenship. And consensus at the end of it may be elusive, but an understanding, a possibility of compromise, I don't think that's too ambitious. So again, I think that's what we can be doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're describing is an environment that can foster an appreciation for a kind of pluralism, and that there's a kind of richness to living in a more pluralistic society, pluralism in the broadest sense, right? Meaning people who do disagree, even on really core values, where people who are of different faith traditions actually do believe fundamentally different things, right? So it's, I mean,
Right.
it's, so it's possible to organize a society where pluralism is understood to be a fact, and also, potentially a real value, especially in arriving at more certain knowledge or insights. And I have noticed that there's less of a value placed on pluralism, that it's not something that we as Americans, in particular, people living in this country, want to protect or even seem to value in a certain way. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the challenge on our campuses and in our society between that comes up between sort of identifying things that maybe we all need to believe, or things that we must share, or things that it's helpful to articulate that are kind of the ground rules of participating in this democratic project. And so things that we sort of have to have in common, and then a value of pluralism. Is there tension there, or is there really nothing that we need to share in order for this all to work?
Boy, it's such a great question. And, again, this again reflects perhaps my Canadian roots, where, we always were trying to define, well, what does it mean to be Canadian? And we would say, well,
really nice. That's what I was
saying. Yeah, really
like,
nice. And we have national socialized medical care, and we're not Americans. But then it was, as you push on it, this question is, and we believe strongly in these ideas of multiculturalism and pluralism. And then the question is, well, what exactly, is there any commonality other than our commitment to this idea of tolerance and pluralism? And so I think the truth is, that if it's just mere tolerance, that doesn't seem to be a strong enough and an animating idea for what citizenship entails. And that's kind of a thin notion of citizenship. But I think we're capable of building that in, but also talking about other things that unite us as a country. And again, I think it's those other things that can embellish and enrich. And in some sense, even that sense of common identity provides the opportunity to be more confident that we can tolerate pluralism and not come apart. And I think that's where we've just got to be working harder on saying, there are some really important things, foundational things that we believe in as Americans, and to put those out. And certainly they'll be contested by some. But again, I'd like to believe that there's still, even in these moments where we're so riven by nasty polarization, there still is some sort of sort of foundational understanding about what it means to be Americans and part of this experiment, and the great pride in so many of the things that this country has accomplished. And again, recognizing all the ways in which it's stumbled and fallen short, but fundamentally still a commitment to wanting to be part of this and to harvest the benefits of that kind of pluralistic identity.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, the kind of pluralism that you're talking about, and sort of identifying how we cultivate respect for that. Maybe we can, there seems to be, what your book suggests, there's a role for a university in demonstrating, perhaps to all of us, the power of the kind of deliberative shared inquiry that you're describing, right? So maybe we all are set in our ways, and I'm really convinced, I don't know, that of this particular, like I'm, like I'm for gun control, or whatever the thing is, I'm for gun control, and somebody over here isn't. But we have to believe that by engaging with one another and trying to understand each other's position, that we will learn more, and that more options will be on the table than were there before, so that there's some productive, the conversations are not simply sort of debates that end in a stalemate, but they're actually productive. And I think we have perhaps not done a good enough job on our campuses of modeling what that productive conversation can look like outside of the classroom. I think it happens in the classroom all the time. There's such diversity in the classroom, but your book is a reminder of that obligation on our part to to fulfill that. And in the same way that you talk about, making sure that we're open, our doors are open, that we're actually, living up to the claims we make about educational opportunity by admitting by seeking out students from all backgrounds, that we're not privileging the already privileged, that we're actually, doing this in a real way. And another question that you talk about is, you talk about the sort of need for sort of accurate knowledge, and we need to embrace open science, you say, with guardrails, so that as a society we can more quickly reap the benefits of discovery, but also protect against the dissemination of false information. And I know that's a real urgent concern for so many people, in addition to sort of educational opportunity and equity. Can you talk a little bit about what that would look like if universities and colleges were actually able to embrace the kind of open science that you're talking about?
So, I think we're doing a lot of it now. A lot of our colleagues are, showing in the most conventional ways, just showing more of the work that they rely upon in making claims that are published, or they're using in their as public intellectuals in their commentary. They're just putting more of their work product on the web and showing how they got the data that they've assembled, the kind of analysis they've done that undergirds the kind of claims that they make. And really, open science is this sense that the more, particularly in the natural and social sciences, that we're seeing a move to reliance on data and claims that are informed by data, that we should just make those data sets available and find ways in which we can, in some sense, show the confidence of our findings by making the primary work product available. And in ways, the steady movement towards this kind of open science parallels a lot of what we see in other settings. One looks at, for instance, the media in the United States and see the extent to which, papers like the New York Times and others, who have really been concerned about, again, their credibility and ensuring that their readership are confident of the factual foundations of the claims that are being made in the reportage. You're seeing more and more a willingness to put the work product up. We're seeing this even in conventional broadcast. More backgrounders on a documentary, and seeing again, producers putting more of the work product up that substantiates the claims. And so I think it's just it is a move to saying, we as academics, if we want to have the public's trust around the claims that we're making, and again, I think what's so important and distinctive about the university is we're a place that really does believe in fact. We believe in contestation. We believe in the sense that that any good argument, and good facts is capable of unseating some kind of received wisdom. So we're constantly open to that kind of checking of truth claims and so forth. And I think that being able to demonstrate how that's reflected in the research that we publish and the advocacy that we do, I think it's really helpful to building confidence in us. And again, reaffirming that the university is really a place apart because we take these ideas of criticism, of skepticism, of fact, of truth claims so seriously. So I think it's just trying to nourish more of that. And if one looks at it, and just in another setting, if one looks at even what we've endured as a society over the last 2 years through the pandemic, but even seeing the extent to which the pace of publication on the part of physicians and others around trends in terms of treatment of COVID patients, of the prospective new therapies, of patterns of intervention, just the rapidity of the pace of this kind of publication. And again, seeing a lot of this being published through preprints before they're even published in journals. And again, there are moments when we know that therapies and claims that are completely ill-founded get some salience. But by and large, I think we found that this was more constructive than not in terms of accelerating our capacity to get good information, good ideas and insights out there, and again, fuel global efforts to try and respond to the seriousness of the pandemic. So again, I think that's a way in which we can show this kind of open science with some guardrails is capable of making us a more effective interlocutor in society.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, you point to these values of the institutions where you and I mean, I don't know, I've spent my whole adult life in one, so where, we have to live up to these commitments that we make, right? We have to actually be open to talent. We have to actually, be engines of educational opportunity. We have to make sure that we're living up to that. We have to make sure that we're living up to the claims we make about the knowledge that we produce. And in order to be trusted, but when we do that, then we can develop the public trust that we need in order to fulfill our obligations to democracy. You also talk about like having a kind of core graduation requirement in sort of democracy, and I wonder, what that would look like. And I'm thinking a little bit of all the controversy. I'm a historian. I'm thinking a little bit about the incredible controversies right now, at the K-12 level, at all these levels about what to teach, and this, these debates, which are often not constructed in a productive way, but like, it doesn't seem to me that it would be easy to identify across a whole range of institutions with the professors across a whole range of disciplines who may believe these institutions are simply failures, may believe that democracy is just a kind of some sort of, smoke screen for other kinds of oppression. How do you come up with identifying what would be core to that requirement?
So I think this is, your point is absolutely right. I don't think we're looking at, and you and I both know, leading universities, the idea of one size fits all within a university, let alone across a broad swath of universities in the United States, publics, privates, research, liberal arts institutions. I mean, that would be preposterous. But I think we can say, though, that again, if we take seriously, and again, if one's agnostic or indifferent to liberal democracy, then I guess, in some sense, we don't have a lot more to talk about. I mean, what this really presupposes is that we believe that there's a set of institutions and a set of practices and habits that are absolutely fundamental to the achievement of highest possible levels of equality and freedom in society. And if we're not ad idem on that, it's really hard to get anyone excited about why should you educate or even think about requirements. But if we get over that hurdle, it seems to me that there's a lot of opportunity across the broad diversity of American higher education to think about what fulfilling that requirement would look like and be authentic to a particular institution. So, Mitch Daniels at Purdue has got there's a test at the end of that he wants students to take, and they are going to take at the end of their 4 years to demonstrate some mastery of core democratic concepts. Other institutions have built introductory courses into their programs that will teach different aspects of democracy. I think this is one where I really would be more interested in the challenge and then seeing the kinds of responses that different institutions make. At Hopkins, we built some of this into our orientation and had this past year, we had a sort of democracy day when we talked about some of the, I think it was probably about 30 faculty members talked about the different ways in which they are thinking about the democratic condition, and some critically, but again with a view to this as being an important discussion. I think there's a number of ways in which you can get at it, and again, it all requires a sense of, I think, commitment and intentionality that this is worth worrying about. And again, if it's not going to happen at the high school level, then we've got to worry about it at the, and maybe it's just remedial, but we've got to worry about it at the university level, because once the students graduate from our institutions, I think we really lose any real opportunity to try and temper the really ugly habits that we're seeing manifest now in American life in terms of the demonization of those from different political parties and just the high levels of distrust. And so I think we have a shot, but it's not one size fits all.
Well, I mean, at Davidson, we have a justice, equality, and community requirement, which is which does a lot of the things that I think you're talking about with respect to education in sort of democratic life and values, with attention also to the ways in which things that subvert that can get perpetuated, right? So structural inequality, for example, in this country, the perpetuation of structural racism, how these things that undermine democracy happen, so that students have the ability to also analyze those things and also have a commitment to undoing them. So, and I know that's part of the kinds of courses that you're talking about at Hopkins. So I think there's a way of doing what you're describing with the guidance of these amazing professors that are committed to helping to educate our students. There's a way to do it perhaps that would unite people who have very different levels of confidence in the institutions we've inherited, right? You wouldn't have to.
I think so. And I think it's just even saying that this is important enough that we're locating this in our curricula, in our orientation, saying this really matters. One of the really significant moments that happened for me at as a university president was about 5-6 years ago. And this was a time in which there were a number of events taking place on campuses across the United States with deplatforming and again, attacks on individual speakers. And what we thought as a first move, we thought it was really important that as students come into the university, literally their first week on campus, is just basically giving them a rudimentary introduction to ideas of free speech, how they connect ideas of academic freedom, why the university is a place apart, and why these things, if you're really going to say what makes a university so distinctive, to my mind, it's a lot about that deep conviction of the importance of this idea of skepticism and contestation and debate as being what makes us again a place apart. And I have to tell you, when we thought about this, I was a little almost sheepish about it, thinking, we're going to bring students in, and it's the first week, and we're going to be doing something that I'm worried that's so rudimentary that it's just going to turn them off. Like, this has got to be sort of mother's milk to them of just knowing about, the case for free speech and why we think this is an important part of the fabric of vibrant democratic life. And for me, the penny dropped as I saw students filing out of this 2-hour session. And I said, well, what did you think of it? I was interviewing the students on the way out, and a number of students said, it was really great. And I said, well, but you've heard these arguments before, of course. And they said, no one ever told us. We've never had this. So that's when all of a sudden, to me, it really underscored the sense of we just can't assume that we are properly acculturating, educating our students for these institutions. And again, I think once you introduce them to the claims for these institutions, then I think it's totally appropriate and desirable to start thinking about a critical assessment of where they're doing well and where they aren't. So I think, to your point, I think we can balance a constructive, respectful, nevertheless critical discussion around these institutions that ultimately will add to, not detract from, one's faith in the enterprise that we feel bound to protect.
Yeah. No, I think when students see examples, I say to my students, we have to be open to new ideas. Had the university not been deeply committed to freedom of inquiry, would we have had academic feminism? No. Right. So all these new fields that would not have been able to emerge had those with authority just gone with what they thought was true, you know? And so I feel like we really have to have some intellectual humility around this and say, you know, we could be wrong. And so there has to be a space where it's possible to think things to question what everyone else takes for granted. Like I remember Lani Guinier, maybe one person, one vote isn't the fairest way to have representation, you know? And so there has to be a place where you get to ask that question. And the university is that place. And so I think if our students can understand freedom of inquiry in that way, that you can question things that structure these institutions, as well as at least understand how they function. You know, Lani Guinier knew why there was one person, one vote. She knew where that came from. She
Right.
just look at. So I think you know, she with this deep respect for trying to promote ideas of equality and freedom, that she asked the question. So I think that's a good example for me of why it's so important to have the kinds of places that you're describing, where these questions can occur, you know, where it's not.
Absolutely. And, just like, there's moments, and now my, time in the academy is long enough, I can look back way back decades ago, but remember very distinctly debates and ideas that seem so counterintuitive, so provocative, maybe even at times really we thought reckless, irresponsible, that with the passage of time, we've come to see as being compelling and right. And so it's the magic of being in a place where you have those moments where your sense of confidence in something that seems so right can be upended and challenged and replaced with something better. And I think that's again what makes us such a special institution in society. And again, I think going back to the sort of the fundamental claim I'm making in the book, it is that we really have a stake in being in a society where we have these kinds of freedoms and again, being seen to be a critical focal point for providing better truth claims, better understanding of society that ultimately trickle out and make our society better.
Absolutely. Well, we have a lot of questions for you from people smarter than I here. So I'm going to try to read some of these questions now from our audience. So here's the first one. The question is, I wonder what the interlocutors think about the extent to which a possession or non-possession of a 4-year diploma has become a political fault line in the US and key arbiter of social opportunity. To what extent are the fancy elite schools, where you and I are, part of the problem? Do we owe more people more things or not?
Well, it's look, we know this critique that is out there, and again, it's and a critique of American higher education, and particularly so-called elite institutions, has become more acute over the last decade. And we know, again, from the Pew polls, what's really disturbing is to see the extent to which there's now a very wide gulf that's opened up between the percentage of Republicans who see American higher education as being good for the country and Democrats who agree with that statement. And it's almost a twofold difference now. It's really dramatic in terms of much higher percentage of Democrats who will say these are good institutions, and Republicans to be skeptical of that. So look, I think, to my mind, it goes back to a number of the claims that I make in the book, is that I don't think this is a time for complacency, that if there is this distrust in us as institutions and as elite institutions, then I think it requires that we look at, is this just entirely the result of a anti-intellectual populist hysteria that has sought to demonize elites, and we're seen to be an elite and cosseted, and as a consequence, we're just a natural target. And so that it's sort of woe is us, but this is really unfair and ill-deserved. Or is it possible that we are doing things that have contributed to that understanding? So one of the things you'll know that I really do focus on in the book is the continuation of legacy preferences in American higher education. And, it is really striking to see the high percentage of institutions that have really clinged tenaciously to the idea that if you are the children of alumni, then you get an advantage coming into those institutions. That to my mind is something that we're contributing to, that really reinforces a perception that we're perpetuating intergenerational advantage rather than trying to weigh against it. So, that's a sort of a simple point in which you say, well, maybe this is an institution and a practice that has to be revisited, because to the extent that it contributes to this sort of public cynicism about what we're all about, maybe we can help ourselves by rethinking a practice like that. So I think there's, again, I think there's ways in which we can do better in how we disseminate information, how we build confidence in our mission, and then again, the way in which, as we've been discussing, we discharge the responsibility to educate our students for the responsibilities in contemporary American democracy. So I think there is no doubt, an impulse that's out there that is going to be directed against us. But I think we've got to be constantly thinking about showing ourselves capable of acknowledging areas where we've stumbled, and then more than that, working hard to be able to disseminate effectively the areas in which we contribute so powerfully to the fabric of the country.
Yeah, and I think I do think with respect to this notion of a 4-year degree that more and more institutions that are traditionally residential are looking for ways to deliver the kind of experiences that we deliver to students on campus more effectively at a lower cost to more people, maybe not the entire experience, but to try to figure out, if you could figure out, for example, what it means to give people everywhere the opportunity to engage with one another, to experience a kind of pluralistic environment, to have opportunities to develop kind of democratic deliberative habits. I think universities can actually take that on maybe and speak to a much broader group of people than simply the students that come to us, and maybe fulfill our obligation to the broader society even more effectively as we take that on, recognizing, at least historically, as speaking for for our own speaking for my own institution, for our own complicity in the past in perpetuating inequality and even like racist structures in the past. So,
but Carol, if you even look at the way in which our discourse has shifted over the decades around these issues of access, and I think we have, I think, in American higher education become more and more sensitive to the various barriers, limitations that impair our ability to truly honor the idea that you're recruiting the best and brightest to your institutions. And we've seen that, with gender, we've seen that with religion and race. And, increasingly, I would say over the last decade, it's been really remarkable the extent to which we've given much greater attention to socioeconomic disadvantage. And even the fact that now in contemporary conversation, institutions are really acutely sensitive to, well, what's the percentage of Pell eligible students you have at your institution? And, there's bragging rights associated with being able to, demonstrate that you're breaking the back of yet another barrier. So I think there's ways in which we're actually showing real sensitivity to some of these traditional critiques. And I think, again, we've got to find ways in which I think, Americans from across the country can imagine that their kids really do have a place in our institutions, and that's credible. That's not just a glib, offhanded remark, but a really true statement. Because I think, again, this is a way in which so much, I think, of the alienation that exists in some quarters is a sense that it's just never going to happen for us. And we're never going to be part of this human capital economy. We're never going to have these kinds of opportunities, and just the sense of understandable alienation and anger that comes from where you really feel that the deck is constantly loaded against you. So I think, again, to the extent that we are working to improve the ability to access our institutions, I think that becomes a counter narrative. And again, this is where it's so important that we also get some help from the federal government on things like Pell loans and Pell grants, rather, so that, that this is, what we're doing in terms of our own efforts to build resources around access, but at the same time, imagining there's still an important public responsibility associated with this.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, so we have a lot of questions that kind of speak to this notion of education as a public good through the citizenship angle. Questions about, can you talk more about the concept of citizenship education and the university's role in that? Maybe could you recommend some examples of institutional design decisions or policies or structures outside of teaching and the curricular that cultivate pluralism and democratic habits? Are the ways the institution can engage the community around it? And how do you combat the sort of information divide and the sort of the idea that we each have our own set of facts if you're going to try to cultivate this use in pluralism? I think people are maybe looking both for a deeper notion of citizenship education and then for some practical examples of things that work.
So I think, for me, at least, there's lots of great examples of institutions that I referred to earlier that are doing interesting experiments in how you're actually trying to educate for democracy. I think in the past decade plus, what we've relied on has been service learning as a good way in which we can scratch the democratic itch. And the idea that, we're giving opportunities in our institutions for students to go out and engage community organizations to learn about the complexities of different issues that community organizations that maybe are dealing with homelessness or dealing with issues of drug addiction, or you name the issues, that students get an opportunity to learn about those problems, to be able to do some volunteer work, and they become better citizens as a consequence. We've done a lot of that. What I think, and the question is really asking is, can we do more than just simply thinking about these habits of volunteerism, of that kind of engaged citizenship, and go back to what you said at the outset, is just the how important it is that we have real participation in formal democratic institutions, voting, being informed about important public policy debates, about being able to understand how you can influence a local politician around an issue that matters to you. These are, I think, competencies and habits that matter, and I think they can be taught. At the same time, that we're really giving our students at least the ability to appreciate how these ideas of equality, freedom, the kinds of institutions that we've constructed, the idea of majoritarian rule, but civil liberties and things that you can't do even by way of majorities to individual citizens, particularly in the context of minority groups and so forth. I think all of these ideas are ones that we should be teaching again through a number of different ways that I hope institutions would experiment with, and again, not taking the easy way out of just saying service learning is sufficient. One thing that's really striking is and there was a recent poll that was published on this, but just seeing the extent to which a growing percentage of young Americans, young Canadians were also included in this study, but again, young adults are express an openness to military or authoritarian forms of government. I mean, we've got to be able to be in a position where our students will understand how dangerous that idea is and why you've got to fight to preserve these institutions that serve as a countervail to that kind of instinct. Again, this requires intentionality.
Yeah, and I think so. I think intentionality, and then again, I think also building trust. So we have a question here that's a little bit asking us to think about our own history. A lot of our institutions are historically and incredibly hostile towards people of color, minorities. We haven't always welcomed everyone into our institutions. And we often, still, as you have made the argument against legacy admissions, sort of award or somehow reward students who don't need financial support, and we somehow perpetuate traditions and customs that that keep us from being a genuinely inclusive environment. So are there things we can do to sort of lead the way in demonstrating kind of what that means to construct a place where we are genuinely inclusive, where folks, particularly who have been historically formally excluded from our communities, are welcomed, and that we've changed ourselves in order to become that place, rather than demand that everybody become like the people who've always been here in order to feel welcome. I think that's the spirit of the question.
And I think that's, again, when we're at our best, I think that's what we do, that we're constantly open to this intellectual renewal, this, and moral renewal, where people are challenging us and we're forced to sort of grapple with existing practices, or perhaps even, history of practices that have somehow, we continue to see the extent to which they still operate to undermine the full potential of an institution. Look, over the past year or so, we were forced to grapple at Johns Hopkins with a pretty disconcerting bit of news about our own founder, who we saw as Johns Hopkins as being someone who was a unionist, and we thought a abolitionist. It's clear he was a unionist. It's not clear that he ever, if he was an abolitionist, or and at what point in his life he had those views, and the true character of them, there's just not much of a paper record. But we also now know that his name turns up as being the holder of enslaved people in his home. And so, what do we do with that? Well, we have embarked upon, as institutions who have had to confront these kinds of truths, we've embarked upon a very serious and sustained interrogation to understand more fully that history, largely, I hope, in an effort to ask, to what extent have there been patterns, decisions that have continued in the university that somehow undermine us today. And so I think, again, it's a belief in fact, it's a belief in debate, it's a belief in the power of ideas to make institutions better. And again, this is one where it's been deeply challenging for us, but one in which, like so many other institutions that have had to open up these chapters of the past, you've got to do it if you're going to be able to persuade people that you're truly capable of taking the hard decisions to make the institution better.
Yeah, and I think, perhaps this is for me the big takeaway from your amazing book, is that we as institutions, as places dedicated to the pursuit of truth, dedicated to creating a genuinely inclusive environment where everybody gets to speak, and because of that, the insights and laws we create is better, that we can somehow model this pluralistic environment without fear, and with a deep sense of accountability for when we haven't lived up to our own values. And if students maybe can have that experience, then they are better prepared maybe to move out into the world as citizens committed to building a more just and humane society. And so I feel like that's, to me, the great lesson of your book. And I'm getting the word here that our time is almost up. So let me just thank you very much for the privilege of being a part of this conversation. And I believe I turn it over to Yolanda for some closing remarks.
Thank you, President Daniels and President Quillen, for this really lively and enlightening discussion. I really enjoyed it. I find myself thinking about what universities owe democracy from the particular standpoint of an academic librarian, who belongs to a profession where access, democracy, diversity, intellectual freedom, the public good, and social responsibility are some of the core values or tenets upon which librarianship is built. And as a librarian who's a strong advocate for the open movement, I was particularly struck, President Daniels, by your call for higher education to fulfill its function as stewards of facts and expertise by embracing open science with guardrails to build a kind of new knowledge ecosystem. And I think that at a time when academic libraries are increasingly being called upon to demonstrate their value, I think today's conversation helps us to think about not only what universities owe democracy, but also the institutions and academic communities that exist within them. So thank you for this great discussion. For those of you who are interested in purchasing a copy of President Daniels' book, What Universities Owe Democracy, and I hope that you do, please visit the independent bookseller Book Culture website. We'll put a link to the purchase page in the Zoom chat. A limited number of signed copies will be made available to attendees of tonight's event as well. We also encourage you to complete our post-event survey. Dave is posting a link of the survey in the chat, and we'll also send it to you via email at the conclusion of the event. We hope tonight's conversation was informative and engaging, and we hope to see you all again at our next event for Women's History Month on Wednesday, March 23rd, featuring Sakila Nzinga. She's the Chief Equity Officer of the state of Illinois. Her recent book, Lean Semesters, How Higher Education Reproduces Inequity, addresses in depth the reality that women of color, particularly Black women, face compounded exploitation and economic inequality within universities. I'm very much looking forward to that conversation as well, and I hope to see you all there. So with that, thank you all for attending, and good night.